Last time I left off reading from Gaslighting, the Double Whammy, Interrogation, and Other Methods of Covert Control in Psychotherapy and Analysis, and the idea, as presented by its author, psychiatrist Theo Dorpat, that, despite all the harms therapists and mental health professionals cause through their serious use of controlling and manipulative behavior, you should exercise restraint. You should not be too critical of them or the author because they do not cause harm intentionally, or at least not all the time. And I know some of this material is difficult to read, listen to, and or follow along with, but the likelihood that this information might be helpful to you at some point in the future seems to be high, given the pervasive and historically invasive nature of the mental health industry. And before digging into the professional literature on the matter, I find the Wikipedia entry a particularly helpful place to start for a broad view. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, latest edition DSM-III, TR, or text revision, published in March 2022, is a publication by the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, for the classification of mental disorders using a common language and standard criteria. It is an internationally accepted manual on the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders, though it may be used in conjunction with other documents. It is used by researchers, psychiatric drug regulation agencies, health insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, the legal system, and policymakers. Some mental health professionals use the manual to determine and help communicate a patient's diagnosis after an evaluation. Hospitals, clinics, and insurance companies in the United States may require a DSM diagnosis for all patients with mental disorders. Healthcare researchers use the DSM to categorize patients for research purposes. In short, the DSM is widely used and for broad contexts, encompassing not only mental health, but medicine as a whole, insurance, social work, although this one is not mentioned here, and even law and government policy. And as a way of introduction to the development of the DSM, I will pull from 2 or 3 professional sources before digging into one specific article in depth. In the article Neurosis, Psychodynamics, and DSM-III, A History of the Controversy, published in 1985, authors Ronald Bayer, Ph.D., and Robert L. Spitzer, M.D., write, and mark the name Spitzer here. He was head of the task force that developed the 3rd edition of the DSM. His name will be reiterated throughout this literature.
And it's kind of the Bible of psychiatry.
The adoption of DSM-III by the American Psychiatric Association, APA, has been viewed as marking a signal achievement for psychiatry. Not only did the new diagnostic manual represent an advance toward the fulfillment of the scientific aspirations of the profession, but it indicated an emergent professional consensus over procedures that would eliminate the disarray that has characterized psychiatric diagnosis. Committed to the rigorous application of the principles of testability and scientific verification, the task force set as its goal the development of an empirically based manual that would raise the low level of reliability of psychiatric diagnosis through the use of explicit and carefully defined criteria. The DSM-II and other classifications were severely flawed by their failure to provide formal criteria for determining the boundaries of their diagnoses. In the absence of such criteria, clinicians had been forced to rely on more global descriptions of disorders that frequently entailed etiological assumptions. Etiological assumptions, that is to say, assumptions about the causes of disorders. From the preface of Making the DSM-V, Concepts and Controversies, published in 2013, edited by Joel Paris, MD, and James Phillips, MD. DSM has sometimes been called the Bible of psychiatry. This seems a strange term to describe a manual that only classifies mental disorders but does not explain them or guide their treatment. Yet while earlier editions of DSM had little impact on clinical practice, DSM-III, published in 1980, was a kind of paradigm shift, reflecting the shift of focus in American psychiatry from psychodynamics to phenomenology and neuroscience. Moreover, DSM-III introduced algorithms for diagnosis that proved popular, even if they were not followed very strictly. This edition of the manual became influential all over the world and also became a standard for almost all research. And you see this reference to the DSM-III and the supposed move away from psychodynamics towards hard science frequently in the literature. And by psychodynamics, the authors are referring to the ideas surrounding unconscious processes and unresolved past conflicts that were popularized by Sigmund Freud and others. As Robert L. Spitzer, MD, writes in the foreword of the book The Loss of Sadness, How Psychiatry Transformed Normal Sorrow into Depressive Disorder, published in 2007. I was the head of the American Psychiatric Association's task force that in 1980 created the DSM-III. This was the first edition of the manual to offer explicit symptomatic criteria for the diagnosis of each mental disorder. Now in its fourth edition, the DSM is generally considered to have revolutionized the psychiatric profession. It serves to define how researchers collect their samples, what conditions insurance companies will reimburse, what conditions courts and social agencies treat as illness, and how individuals themselves interpret their emotional experiences. The DSM's standardization of psychiatric diagnosis by using explicit rules for making a diagnosis has been critical to the explosion of research and knowledge in the mental health field. It has allowed clinicians and researchers with different theoretical perspectives and thus different languages to communicate with each other. It has also addressed doubts about psychiatry's scientific status, such as concerns about the reliability of its diagnoses. And in relation to this idea that the DSM revolutionized psychiatry and the related mental health professions and how, in its third edition, it established reliable diagnostic criteria and thereby addressed doubts about psychiatry's scientific status, I will read extensively from the article, The Myth of the Reliability of DSM, published in the Journal of Mind and Behavior in 1994 by Stuart A. Kirk from UCLA School of Social Welfare and Herb Cutchins from California State University, Sacramento. As the authors write, since 1974, when development began for the third edition of the American Psychiatric Association's bestseller, The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, there has been a concerted effort to emphasize the language, symbols, and customs of science in the process of continually revising DSM. There are good reasons for this emphasis. DSM represents a major way of organizing psychiatric knowledge, research efforts, and treatment approaches. At the same time, DSM is a prominent bid by psychiatrists for professional legitimacy and influence. Such an important classificatory scheme should not be based on whimsy or fad, but on whatever scientific evidence is available. Furthermore, continual revision of DSM should be justified by major scientific advances. And in fact, the revisers of DSM since 1968 all claimed that each revision is much more scientific than its predecessor. Precisely because DSM-III has been described as a watershed document, a stunning achievement, a scientific revolution, and as having brought about a transformation of American psychiatry, the claims of its developers deserve careful scrutiny. It is often very difficult to assess such claims because the revisions of DSM involve not one or a few central changes, but hundreds of them. No one person can possibly assess all the relevant scientific evidence for each of these changes. When there are references to evidence that is purported to justify changes, it often comes from data gathered in special field trials that are rarely available to the public until most major decisions have been made. In the case of the development of DSM-IV, due to be published in 1994, there have been frequent references to special reanalyses of unpublished datasets that are also not readily available. Thus, the scientific integrity of the revision process cannot be assessed until long after a revised DSM is published. But then, the next revision is underway and criticism of the last revision appears petty or irrelevant or both. But unless past claims by proponents of DSM are scrutinized in light of the scientific evidence that was used at the time, we are unable to evaluate the extent to which science and systematic evidence support the process of continual revision. Diagnostic reliability as a solved problem. Among the hundreds of scientific claims made by the developers of each revision of the manual, some claims are specific to only one diagnostic category, while other claims are much broader. Perhaps the broadest claim made about DSM-III was that it was much more reliable than earlier versions. Reliability is the extent to which clinicians can agree on the same diagnoses when independently assessing a series of patients. Diagnostic unreliability was viewed explicitly by the developers of DSM-III as a central scientific problem that DSM-III, with its diagnostic criteria and reliance on science, was supposed to solve. Because this claim was broad, clear, substantively significant, frequently made by the developers, and appeared to be empirically verifiable, we chose to examine it in some detail. The claim that DSM-III reduced the problem of reliability was made so effectively that it has shaped how DSM's reliability has been interpreted since 1980. Here the authors cite several prominent psychiatrists and psychologists who claimed in the 1980s that the DSM-III improved, if not solved, the problem of reliability. These bold statements are illustrative of how widespread and firm is the belief that DSM's reliability is no longer a serious problem, although it should be noted that a few observers have questioned these claims. Other indirect signs suggest that reliability is not viewed any longer as a major scientific issue. When work began on the revision of DSM-III, no official plans were announced that there would be field tests of the reliability of the new system. Moreover, no one even suggested that such tests might be useful. Since the revision, known as DSM-III-R, was only supposed to improve the manual, which was widely heralded as reliable, no new reliability studies were thought to be necessary. There was no perceived need to revisit a problem that was already solved. As will be discussed later, however, a related reliability study of DSM-III-R was conducted as a test of a structured interview protocol, but was not published until 5 years later. In relation to the future publication of the DSM-IV, the authors emphasize the following. How reliably clinicians use it in their regular practice will be seen as an irrelevant question. If its actual use is later found to be unreliable, the developers will probably argue that it is due to the mistakes of practitioners, not because of the design of the diagnostic system itself. Oddly enough, this is echoed in the preface of Making the DSM-V Concepts and Controversies from 2013, from which I read moments ago. DSM-III introduced algorithms for diagnosis that proved popular, even if they were not followed very strictly. Any potential problems with the DSM-III in light of DSM-V being published, mind you, certainly seems here to be blamed on past diagnosticians or clinicians rather than the DSM-III itself, as Stuart Kirk and Herb Cutchins continue. The emergence of the reliability problem. In this historical context here is of particular importance. The current consensus that diagnostic reliability is not a serious problem for DSM marks a dramatic shift of opinion since the 1970s. Melvin Sapshin, the longtime medical director of the American Psychiatric Association, recently described the 1960s as constituting a crisis for American psychiatry. During the 1950s and 1960s, psychiatry and the mental health professions were confronted with many serious criticisms. The effectiveness of psychotherapy was questioned. Psychiatrists were accused of over-reliance on involuntary commitment and of violating the civil liberties of citizens. Mental health professionals were criticized for failing to respond to the mental health needs of the poor and minorities and for being inattentive to the quality of institutional care. No challenge was as fundamental, however, as the challenges to the concept of mental illness itself. These challenges came from psychiatrists like Saz, who argued that mental illness was a myth used to disguise the bitter pill of moral conflicts. From sociologists such as Goffman and Scheff, who suggested that mental illness was merely another example of how society labels and controls those who do not behave. from behavioral psychologists who challenged psychiatry's fundamental reliance on intrapsychic, unobservable phenomena, and from gay activists who challenged the APA's listing of homosexuality as a mental disorder. The APA's listing of homosexuality as a mental disorder in the DSM-II is frequently cited as one of the reasons Robert Spitzer became head of the task force of the DSM-III in the 1970s, including by Spitzer himself. All of these attacks raise serious questions about psychiatry and about its legitimacy as a scientifically based profession. And I will emphasize this point now, as I will come back to it later. Although many of these attacks were on the validity of diagnosis, it was the reliability of diagnosis that became the focus of sustained attention. On the surface, diagnostic reliability seemed like the problem that needed to be resolved first, because the reliability of a classification scheme set a limit on its potential validity. If diagnoses could not be made more consistently, little progress could be made on questions of empirical validity. Furthermore, reliability as a problem seemed easier to understand and appeared, at the time, to be a relatively easy problem to solve. Documenting unreliability. Whatever doubts experts had about whether reliability was a serious problem disappeared shortly after the publication of an enormously influential article titled A Reanalysis of the Reliability of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And this was written by none other than Robert Spitzer along with Joseph Fleiss in 1974. This frequently cited article, perhaps more than any other, forcefully established diagnostic unreliability as an important problem. It effectively made the case that the state of diagnostic reliability was even worse than it had seemed. This paper played a pivotal role that has proved durable for 2 decades in recasting the past. Frequently, reference to this article is the only citation needed when authors make assertions about psychiatry's poor reliability prior to DSM-III. The major contribution of the article consisted of the use of the kappa statistic to recompute the findings of 6 earlier reliability studies. Kappa is a measure of the extent of agreement between 2 clinicians diagnosing the same patients. The measure ranges from 0 to 1. Its novelty is that it factors out the proportion of agreement that could be expected by chance alone. Kappa is defined as the proportion of improvement actually obtained by clinicians, over and above chance agreement. 0 is only chance levels of agreement. 1 is perfect agreement. For example, 0.50 is an agreement level halfway between the chance level and perfect agreement. Kirk and Cutchins address the use of kappa in this article by Spitzer and Fleiss in some detail and conclude with the following. By emphasizing the negative, the authors highlighted the threat and unacceptability of the current state of diagnostic reliability in order to make an effective call to action. By claiming that the consistency of diagnoses was weak, and thereby implying that this unreliable diagnostic system lacked validity, they buttressed their argument that something dramatic must be done or psychiatry would be gravely threatened. Equally important, Spitzer and Fleiss thought the possible solutions to the problem were in hand. Thus, criticisms of past practice was a way of promoting certain innovations that the authors and their colleagues were actively developing. One of these innovations was diagnostic criteria. Because DSM-II contained vague descriptions of many disorders, these psychiatric researchers were trying to correct this deficit by developing lists of specific indicators or criteria that should be present when using each major diagnostic label. Articles describing these research-oriented innovations became some of the most cited papers in the psychiatric literature, of course, including works by Spitzer himself. Finally, the task force to develop DSM-III was being formed at exactly the same time as the 1974 article appeared. This task force became one of the most important committees in psychiatry in the 20th century, and it is noteworthy that the senior author of this influential paper, Spitzer, was appointed as chair of that task force. A renewed attack on the weaknesses of DSM-II and indirectly on the state of American psychiatry could be expected to give those in charge of developing DSM-III extra leverage in the struggle to renovate psychiatric nosology. Nosology meaning the classification of diseases. In this broad context, the 1974 article served as an important affirmation of the reliability problems of the past, while it set the stage for the proposed solution. By the mid-1970s, the psychiatric journals were alive with various reports about diagnostic criteria as the way to solve the reliability problem. Also, interestingly enough, including articles involving Spitzer, an approach that the developers of the new manual indicated was going to be incorporated into DSM-III, promoting the reliability of DSM-III. When DSM-III was published in 1980, the developers made claims about the reliability of the radically new diagnostic system they had devised. The data they presented came from special field trials, which, in this case, consisted of responses to solicitations from the DSM-III developers to researchers and clinicians throughout the country to collaborate with a colleague in independently diagnosing several patients. Participants were asked to send the results to the developers. This field trial involved 2 phases and also included a study using case vignettes. The focus here is on how the data from the field trials were interpreted by the developers. The data from the field trials were offered as evidence for the developers' claims of greatly improved reliability in several tables of data in an obscure 6-page appendix in the 500-page manual and in several other brief journal articles. This is what the authors are referencing: kappa coefficients of agreement for axes 1 and 2, DSM-III diagnostic classes for adults 18 and older, Table 1 from page 470, and Table 2 from page 471. The large tables of numbers and kappa values were not readily interpretable by most mental health professionals. Most users of DSM were not particularly troubled by reliability or knowledgeable about ways to measure it. Consequently, they were not particularly critical of the studies upon which these numbers were based. They either ignored these studies or relied on the developers of the impressive new manual to explain the meaning of these numbers. Here, Kirk and Cutchins evaluate the DSM field trial data, documenting serious limitations. And as the authors continue, despite all the limitations of the data, DSM-III was introduced to the world using the bold language of success. The actual reliability of DSM-III could have been described more modestly as about what we expected, similar to previous studies, no worse than in the 1950s and 1960s, and possibly somewhat better, uneven but promising, and so on. This would have been a language of partial and limited success, but that language would not have been very powerful and was certainly not what people wanted to hear. The launching of DSM-III after 5 years of bitter struggle was not a time for raising doubts about its reliability, the very problem that the DSM-III was supposed to solve. Is DSM-III revised any better? Although uneven and very modest, the reliability levels achieved in the DSM-III field trials tend to be higher than most other studies that have been done subsequently. No studies of the reliability of DSM as a whole, when used in natural clinical settings, as distinct from 1 or 2 categories in specialty settings, have shown uniformly high reliability. The most recently published major study is quite instructive, since it was conducted by some of the principal participants in the development of DSM-III and DSM-III-R, and utilized all of the techniques that had been developed to improve diagnostic reliability. The study was conducted at 6 sites in the United States and 1 in Germany. Experienced mental health professionals at the 7 sites were selected to be interviewers. There were several rounds of training provided by the senior project staff, including the use of audio-taped interviews, monthly conference calls, on-site training, and a 2-day training session of interviewers from all the sites. After this training and practice, 592 people were interviewed by pairs of the highly trained staff. The subjects consisted of 390 psychiatric patients and 202 people from a non-psychiatric patient population. Such a study is the envy of researchers who attempt to conduct rigorous studies in clinical settings. The care and competence of those conducting this study should be expected to produce the highest diagnostic reliability that is possible in supervised research settings. In normal clinical settings, reliability would be expected to be lower. The findings of this elaborate reliability study were disappointing even to the investigators. And just as a reminder to help with this next passage, kappa is a measure of the extent of agreement between two clinicians diagnosing the same patients. The measure ranges from 0 to 1. 0 is only chance levels of agreement. 1 is perfect agreement. The kappa values are not all that different than those from the pre-DSM-III studies, and in some cases appear to be worse. Among the patient sample, aggregated across the 5 sites, the kappas range from 0.40 to 0.86 and had a weighted average kappa of 0.61. And as the authors noted earlier, for example, 0.50 is an agreement level halfway between the chance level and perfect agreement. Among the non-patient community sample at 2 sites, the kappas ranged from 0.19 to 0.59 and averaged 0.37. Despite the scientific claims of great success, reliability appears to have improved very little in 3 decades. Conclusion. The process of revising DSM is increasingly shrouded in the rhetoric of science, but if one looks intensively at what was identified as the core scientific problem of diagnosis in the 1970s, unreliability, one discovers that the scientific data used to claim success and great improvement simply do not support the claim. In fact, it appears that the reliability problem is much the same as it was 30 years ago. Only now, the current developers of DSM-IV have de-emphasized the reliability problem and claim to be scientifically solving other problems. If, as the developers of DSM-III insisted, an unreliable diagnostic system could not be valid, there is ample reason to conclude that the latest versions of DSM as a clinical tool are unreliable, and therefore of questionable validity as a classification system. If the interpretations of the data regarding this critical core problem have been somewhat misleading, how much confidence should we have in the hundreds of other changes in the DSM that have been and will be justified by claims that they are based on science and data? I will move on and address the development of the subsequent editions of the DSM, but it is striking how, with all of the attacks on the validity of diagnosis and a clear cultural push against the mental health industry in the 1960s and the 1970s, how the American Psychiatric Association, with a few key figures, as it would appear, with Robert Spitzer leading the charge, managed to switch the focus to the reliability of diagnosis and to quickly present a supposedly scientific solution to the problem, the DSM-III. And again, to reiterate and harp on the same point, think of the current message that therapy is for everyone, or the idea that you should not talk to family or friends about everyday problems, because they are biased, unlike the therapist, of course, and most importantly, because family or friends could have a mental illness themselves. And people have bought in. But next, I will look at the supposedly scientific problems subsequent editions of the DSM have gone on to address. I hope to see you there.